Everyday injustice. Too many wrongful convictions. Corruption has infected the criminal justice system, leaving too many people helpless, fighting for their lives. Instead of receiving justice, people suffer. Is that why they say justice is blind?
Today on Everyday Injustice, we have McCracken Poston. He is the author of the book Zenith Man, Death, Love, and Redemption in a Georgia Courtroom. Welcome, McCracken.
Thank you so much, David. I'm glad to be here.
So I think, before we get into your book, your backstory seems pretty interesting. You were a four-term member of the Georgia House of Representatives and then lost a Congress bid. Can you tell us a little bit about that and how you then transitioned into this case?
Well, I guess I have my feet in different eras of Georgia politics. I got elected at a very young age I think I was 27 or 28 to the Georgia legislature. I think I was the youngest person there at the time, and went and served 4 tumultuous years. I was a bit of a reformer. A couple of reasons. One, I developed type 1 diabetes while I was in the legislature, and it just kind of changes your perspective, realizing your own mortality. The old Georgia tradition of sitting there and saying nothing for a decade until you got to carry a bill, that didn't appeal to me. And the other thing that really kind of affected me was watching a bill be so lobbied that it was just left a bad taste in my mouth. And so I came back with a bill to make lobbyists register in Georgia and make them report the gifts that they give to legislators. Well, you can imagine that didn't make me very popular under the gold dome of the Georgia Capitol, but it was needed, and Georgia was one of the, few states that had no regulations on lobbying. So the other thing that changed was that I had both feet in was 2 eras of Georgia politics. When I went in, Georgia was a majority Democratic state. It was almost entirely blue in terms of statewide offices, and the legislature was pretty overwhelmingly Democratic. Well, that changed. And it changed on election night of 1996 when I ran for U.S. Congress and got my butt handed back to me on a silver platter, and lost huge. And it smarted it put me in a position of really um, kind of going back home and licking my wounds when nothing else that potentially had promised for me came through. And so the next thing you know, I have this very unusual man that my family knew because my sister went to school with him, and my dad loved doing business with him in his Zenith TV repair shop, and that was Alvin Ridley. And this is a picture that's the cover of the book, and Alvin is kissing his soon-to-be wife in a photo booth at a little amusement park in our community. And Alvin and Virginia got married in Ringgold, Georgia. Ringgold is my town, and it was kind of the marriage mill of the Southeast, because of its proximity to Alabama, Tennessee, and North Carolina. And because Tennessee and North Carolina are they're not very north-south, not very wide, tall states. Other Kentucky people and others Virginia came down to get married in Ringgold because it was one-stop shopping. Well, Dolly Parton and Carl Dean slipped down against her manager's wishes, but brought her mother, and she wed in Ringgold, Georgia in May of 1966. 3 weeks later, this couple, Alvin Ridley and Virginia Hickey, went and got their marriage license in Ringgold. But by the time George Jones and Tammy Wynette came to Ringgold to get married in 1969, Virginia was missing. And her parents had put out this article in both the local paper and in the Chattanooga, Tennessee papers, declaring that she was missing. Interestingly enough, said she had been a resident and resided with her husband. It's not asking anybody to question Alvin, it's just saying she's missing. And that was one of the bookmarks of her existence. The other one was tragically in 1998, this tabloid with the title, "Sicko Holds Wife Hostage 30 Years, Then Kills Her." So those were the two references to Virginia Hickey Ridley in her life, in the media. And they were the bookends of her absence from the community and from her family. And they created this situation where conjecture and speculation overwhelmed an investigation. Virginia had epilepsy from childhood. Alvin said from day one she had a spell, but because this was a woman whose own family, now her father was dead and her mother was in a nursing home, but her siblings kind of picked up the mantle of the old allegations from 1968 and said she was held against her will. And so ultimately Alvin was charged with her murder, even though she had a seizure. She had epilepsy, and he said she had a seizure. So I really couldn't figure it out when he was kind of stalking me on the street. Turns out Alvin knew my sister and he knew my father, and I guess he knew I needed a challenge. And so I kind of took him on first in a very informal capacity, just trying to calm him down and tell him not to speak to law enforcement, which he immediately disobeyed and talked to every law enforcement officer that ever wanted to talk to him. And but nothing happened. And so we reached the agreement that if anything happened, he would know where to find me at my office. He didn't need an appointment because he didn't like to make appointments. Or if I heard something happen to him, I would seek him out. And that's what happened in late July of 1998, when he was indicted by special presentment to the grand jury and then arrested. And I went to him and said, okay, it's real now. But Alvin was very difficult as a client. And I couldn't figure that out. I couldn't figure out why he wouldn't just talk to me about his wife. He was obsessed with ancient, I call ancient, 15-year-old civil litigation, where he was suing everybody over a car accident that his father was not injured in and drove away from. But Alvin claimed that that was the end of his business, particularly when a counterclaimant in those cases seized a Chevy van, his other company vehicle. Well, Alvin was obsessed with that van. And I would say, well, we really need to talk about your wife. And he would say, well, no, we don't. I didn't kill her, but the county did take my van. And what happened was the sheriff executed what they thought was a valid judgment on the van. That's just how the civil process works. When somebody gets a judgment against you, they can lay claim to an asset, a movable asset, and they can take it. Well, after obsessing about this van for so long, it just became a distraction, to where the conversation would always loop back to the van, no matter what. And at some point, and then we would end up screaming at each other. and Alvin would really melt down. And at some point in our conversation, he brought up the van, and I just, in exasperation, I just went, "Oh Lord, the van." Well, Alvin got quiet, and I looked at him, and he was in a childlike prayer pose, his eyes tightly closed and his hands clasped. Well, I knew I could work with that. So I just started praying my legal advice to him. He was very respectful if you were praying. He wouldn't interrupt. He wouldn't scream. And so pretty much from then on out, when things started going off the rails, I'd say, "Let us pray." And I would just give my legal advice to him in the form of a prayer, because he would be quiet. He was respectful. And so, but we didn't have anything. And I had a client who was being there very difficult. And so we went on into the summer and late summer, about this time of year, and that National Examiner article came out, Sicko, and I knew we were going to have a problem then. I hated that headline when trying to represent him.
Right.
Now, let me tell you, selling a book, I love it now.
Right.
But it was tough, and it was tough for Alvin to see that.
Um,
So
if you don't mind, one of the interesting things you brought up, how difficult it was, and he's fixated on this van. And, I'm not an attorney, but I'm in the same boat as you. Like, there are people who come to me and they want us to look into their case, and they give you this, 20-hour story, and you're like, no, 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 we gotta focus here. And so I can I mean, I can't work with people like that sometimes. So
well, you just described my summer of 1998. And it was so difficult. And but there was a break. It was a tragic break. But when the state's autopsy of Virginia Ridley opined that she had way too much petechia, which are tiny broken blood vessels around her eyes and her mouth, way too much for a seizure. So it had to be some type of mechanical asphyxiation or smothering. Well, Alvin said, she had a seizure in the night. When I woke up, she's on her face. And it's not advisable for a person who's prone to seizures to sleep on their face. And Alvin turned her over, tried a pitiful attempt at CPR. He didn't know what CPR meant, or the way he described it, it was not very effective, but I think she had been dead for several hours. So we just had this tragic break, and that was the death of Olympic track star Florence Griffith Joyner of a seizure disorder. And I got her autopsy, and she had a lot more petechial hemorrhages than Virginia did. And so if the Georgia's theory is she has too much petechia for it to be a seizure death, then by their standards, Flojo was brutally murdered. And we all know that wasn't the case, because she got a world-class autopsy. She was dogged with performance-enhancing drug rumors. So there was a real effort to get it right. And as it turned out, the strongest thing she had in her for months and months was Benadryl and Tylenol in therapeutic levels. So she was vindicated in her death from the bad rumors by jealous competitors or people who didn't want to recognize her sheer greatness. But we had something with that. But the problem is, Alvin would not let me in his house. And now we're going on over a year since I was advising him, and I was asking all the time because I wanted to photograph this article. Started talking about bars on the windows and a virtual prison. I wanted to prove that wasn't wrong. I could tell there were no bars on the windows from the outside. So I decided to help Alvin out because I have an Atlanta-based cell phone, and I said, Alvin, I'm going to get a phone installed, your phone reinstalled in your house. And I came with the phone man. Of course, I have my camera, and Alvin decides then and there to have the phone installed on the porch on the outside of the house. So, he just did not trust me. Alvin also had a strange, a deep suspicion of local and state government, but he had a corresponding hope and trust in the federal government. Well, a couple of instances that almost tripped us up because one, he missed our motions hearing. And the judge told me I needed to find him or he was going to spend the rest of his time in jail if he wouldn't come to court. I found him at the VA. I had introduced him to Veterans Administration Medicine when I found out he was a veteran. And he ran up there and told them that he had to miss court because he was bitten by a giant spider. So I'll go, I called and they said, yeah, he's here because I was one of the people they could tell.
Do you keep a straight face through all this, by the way?
Oh, I was in agony. I was in agony. I was hating all of this. The judge gave me a couple of hours to get him and bring him back to court by the afternoon session. I went and got him and I just told him off the whole way back to the courthouse. Didn't even stop for lunch, just took him straight to the courtroom. And, I go up to the bench and I said, Your Honor, he's here now. He says he got bit by a giant spider. And I may have even used the actual air quotes. And the judge started to lay into him, but then stopped suddenly, his color leaving his face. And I turned around and Alvin's making his own case. He raised his shirt and there is a grotesque wound on his belly.
Of course.
He obviously got bit by a giant spider. And I felt really guilty, but the judge put our motions hearing off. Now, so we had the FloJo.
But the judge had the same reaction as you. Like,
this
can't be happening to this guy, right?
Yeah, he had the same reaction. Well, the next big break, possibly the biggest break, was Alvin insisted that I study a bunch of old civil litigation, and he refused to cooperate in the criminal case until I got up to speed on the civil cases, as if he could reopen them. And I was talking to him about, statute of limitations, and I'm looking at it and I'm thinking, wait a minute, you got the van back in 3 weeks? You got the van back that you're obsessing over? And he said, yeah, but I haven't accepted it yet. So the van was returning to the earth 15 years untouched, because in Alvin's world, if he touched it, it triggered some kind of new statute of limitations, and Alvin wanted to keep his options open. So another thing I found in the civil litigation was an eviction. I just looked up everything that had Alvin's name on it. It was a 1970 eviction from the new public housing project in Ringgold, and where the young, newly married couple in 1968, Alvin in Virginia, moved into a 2-bedroom unit. Well, they were being evicted. And of course, Alvin makes it into a jury trial. And I'm looking at this file and I see that they were ultimately evicted, but I see a jury list and I recognize the name of somebody. Now, this was 27 years before, but I recognize the name of Mary Hakes, and I had represented her son recently. So I called Mary Hakes and I said, "You won't remember this, but you were a juror in an eviction." She says, "I remember it like it was yesterday. This was like a circus." And this man was just making it such a show. And suddenly the judge just stopped everything and said, "Mr. Ridley, go send for your wife." What it really was Virginia's parents flushing her out into the public. And there's a Superior Court judge ordering that Alvin send for his wife with someone else. Alvin sent his father. Virginia came into the old Catoosa County courtroom September 15, 1970. She told the judge, she told the jury, "I'm where I want to be. I'm with my husband." And she had a very Old Testament view on marriage. Like, once we were married, we are one. I got corrected recently and told that was New Testament, but I think in any event, it was a very strong opinion of marriage. And her parents had to sit there and listen to it. And then, just to make sure, the judge had her and her parents go back into chambers, but would not let Alvin go. And they emerged, and she went home with she went back home with Alvin, but they were evicted. So they set up housekeeping with his parents in Ringgold. And so that was, I thought, fascinating, because here's, but her parents are gone for all intents and purposes. So Mary Hakes was the only one I could use, and if I could even get that evidence in. So I got a continuance, which was really critical, because the state had just dumped 45 new witnesses on me, and I'm a sole practitioner. So I was, I was so relieved to get this continuance. But Thanksgiving came, and I had remarried, and we were going to see our families. And when we were leaving my family, my parents were making a plate, and I thought, "Oh, great, get to take some food home." Well, they made another plate, and they said, "We want you to take this to Alvin Ridley. He's all alone." And I thought, that's the last thing I want to do on Thanksgiving, is go to this guy's house. He won't even let me in his house. But I took my wife home, and this was a relatively new wife I'm putting this poor woman through. And she's from Ringgold, so she had all the boogeyman stories about Alvin Ridley, and she was always worried about me going there. But I went there, and I knocked on the door, and he came to the door, and he looked at the bag, and I said, "Alvin, my parents wanted you to have a turkey plate." And I began to realize how transactional Alvin was. He knew he needed to give me something. So he said, "Just a minute." I could hear him go in. He was like turning the TV down. He came out and opened the door and said, "Come in." Now, I didn't have a camera, but I was not going to pass this opportunity up. So I went in a very dark and difficult house to be in. Alvin was not much of a housekeeper. I could tell from the coroner's photos that it was at one time a neatly kept house. Not a lot of clutter, but now the clutter was taking over. And Alvin had made some clutter on a wall, all of one wall and part of another, where he is attaching pieces of paper to the wall. And it was not completely wallpapered, but they were very close to each other, maybe a couple of inches apart, and there were hundreds. And as my eyes adjusted, I looked, and they all seemed to be in the same hand. And so I said to Alvin, I said, "Who wrote this?" And my heart was racing, because I hoped that it was this mystery woman. And Alvin said, "Well, Virginia did." And I showed way too much excitement. I said, "Alvin, I got to have this stuff. It's critical." Here's an example of her writing. Very unique hand. The way handwriting analysts work is they want some known writings, and known writings are ones that whose verification is enhanced by either it being notarized or it being on an official document like a driver's license. But Virginia had no such official documents. And then I remembered they got married. And fortunately, her maiden name was Hickey, which meant the very same Y was in all of the writings. Anytime she had a Y, it had an unusual descender and flare on it. And it went from very mundane, menu for dinner, to TV shows, cast of the Waltons TV show that she liked, to almost fangirl crush on Ron Howard, the actor, director, producer, from childhood. And it was fascinating. But Alvin said, you can't have it. It's all I've got left of her. And I grabbed his hands and we started praying. And I even, said, oh Lord, give us a sign if we should not use this, because I know Virginia wants Alvin to use her writings. And then I was quiet. I counted to 10 and no, okay, God, thanks for that definitive sign that we should use these. And Alvin said, I'll think about it. Well, I remembered his being very transactional. And I said, Alvin, I'll give you $100 just to copy them, because I got to give copies to the DA. We've opted in on discovery. And he came back with $200 and I'll let you copy them, but I keep the originals. So that was a compromise I could live with, but Alvin lugged these originals into court in 2 ancient suitcases that were really old and battered. And when we went to trial, first, he didn't want to go to trial, and he would say that the U.S. Constitution says you don't go to court when you're sick. And I said, well, Alvin, usually the court will relieve you from going to court when you're sick, but he's not going to let that last forever. And we have to show that you're actually sick. And Alvin had the psychological evaluation did reveal a slight paranoid condition, but also
Only slight?
Well, somatization. And I got to learn somatization, where he truly believed physical ailments were real. So he started wearing this ridiculous, oversized neck brace everywhere he went. And he got to where he could barely walk. And I was very frustrated with him because I felt that it was probably not. There's the neck brace. Because his reason for it was ridiculous. He said the sheriff worried him off the roof and he hurt his head, neck, spine, back, tailbone. That's how he would say it, but he would say it real fast. Well, when Alvin brought these original writings into the courtroom every day, and your viewers may be familiar with this case, may sound familiar because it has been on American Justice, called Death in a Small Town, and it's been on Forensic Files, called Killigraphy, a little play on calligraphy that I never liked. But in any event, in the Forensic File episode, you'll hear the jurors remarking how, as Alvin opened these suitcases, cockroaches began to flow out of them into the courtroom. Well, we went on for 3 days, and it was almost as if Alvin brought a whole new suitcase full of cockroaches every time he came to court. Well, the bailiffs and everybody, they were kind of making fun at me. Everything funny in this book is at my expense, I guarantee you. But the judge finally said on the third day of the trial, Mr. Poston, we're going to move into the old courthouse so that I can get my courtroom fumigated. And we did. Now, here's what's eerie. I realized it as we were moving in. We are bringing Virginia's writings into the last place she had ever been seen in public, September 15, 1970, in the courtroom of the eviction trial. And I felt supercharged because now I could tell my jury she stood right here and told a judge who was sitting right there, I'm with my husband and that's where I want to be. And she was furious at her parents for getting them evicted from public housing. The allegation was that they weren't really staying there, but Virginia answered everything in her writings. There were over 15,000 writings that I found.
Wow.
She told about the exterminator coming in on her while she was taking a bath in that apartment and then kind of making a move on her. And so instead of confrontation, which was not Alvin's way, they just kind of tried to anticipate when the exterminator was coming and they would leave and they would stay away from the place for a week or two at a time. So it fed into Virginia's parents' allegation that she was gone and he was getting a 2-bedroom apartment and didn't even have his wife living there. And so what should have been settled on September 15, 1970 gets revived when Virginia turns up dead. And probably because Virginia's parents were they weren't either here anymore or they were in a nursing home. And they weren't here to say, well, she kind of told us what's what and told us she didn't appreciate us getting her evicted. But it fell upon her siblings and they lifted the mantle of these old allegations. And it was a bizarre case, a woman that hadn't been seen in so long. But what was great was Alvin is a pack rat. And so when the state tried to say, well, he was depriving her of medicine. Well, there was a Bible where Virginia wrote her most important things. And she wrote September of 1977, 20 years and 1 month before she died, she declared that God told her to stop taking her medicine. Virginia's background, and this was even coming from her siblings, was that as much as she needed the medicine for epilepsy, she often had allergic reactions to the medicine, which was almost worse than a seizure. So Virginia just decided, she and God decided that she was no longer going to take that medicine, and she noted it. Well, thanks to Alvin's pack rat nature, I had all the medicine bottles, and I had empty ones up until September of 77, and then we had several months of full ones, showing that Alvin continued to get her the medicine.
This is pretty extraordinary, if you don't mind. So, these cases are nightmares, and under the best of circumstances, you have a crime that didn't actually happen. You have a medical evidence which has been misdiagnosed by the authorities, and I can't tell you how many people end up getting wrongly convicted based on that.
Yeah.
And you have this paranoid, uncooperative client on top of that, and yet you ran into all these fortunate things.
It was as if, and by the way, the plan all along was, Alvin, there's no way you can testify. And I told him, I said, because we can't talk about your wife without you turning it into a talk about this 1977 Chevy van that was only gone for 3 weeks, but you still haven't touched it. And let me tell you that last month, 40 years, the van has not been untouched. Has not been touched. It's remained untouched. And Alvin seemed to accept that. But we had kind of a disastrous witness. The one witness that got Alvin excited about the case and engaged in the case was this forensic pathologist that we found on the 1998 internet. In 1998, I thought, they're on the internet. They've got to be legit. It was a disaster. This person wasn't even licensed to do what he was testifying about. So it just was a real gut punch. Well, during lunch, Jesus appeared to Alvin and told him he needed to testify. Well, that's always the defendant's call, whether to testify or not testify. A lawyer cannot overrule them. But I wanted to show him the hazards. And so, but I knew I couldn't keep him from it. Well, it turned out it was the best thing ever. He goes up there with his neck brace, and as the Jack Warner with the Atlanta Journal-Constitution wrote, Alvin Ridley finally got to take the stand he had been trying to take for 30 years. And in all of his civil litigation and in the eviction, he never got far enough to take the stand. And now he got to do it. And I just let him flow. I just let him talk about everything, the van, everything, because the jury was picking up on this guy may be special needs,
Yeah.
I also realized that the DA wasn't going to get anywhere with him because I couldn't get anywhere with him for 15 months. But Alvin was very literal, and he was actually doing very well. As long as I remembered he was very literal, but I would forget it because he was doing so well. So at one point I said, Alvin, I was trying to close strong. And I said, Alvin, tell the jurors what you've lost. And I wanted him to say, the love of my life, my best friend. And he looked at me kind of funny and he goes, well, I guess the funeral bill. I saw the DA jotting it down. I knew. And sure enough, in his closing, he said how cold and detached that all he really lost was the funeral bill. Well, Alvin did a wonderful job, and he was acquitted. 20 years later, Alvin and I were just giving this story away. We were talking to any podcast. It was such a great, unusual story with some twists and turns. And introduced oh, by the way, before my epilepsy expert went on the stand, he said, is there anything else unusual about this woman? Just hours before I put him on the stand. He was going to testify about the petechia being normal and actually, quite normal for seizure. I said, yeah, she couldn't burp without writing it down. He said, that's hypergraphia. He said, it happens with some temporal lobe epilepsy patients. He said, I've got patients that they bring me their journals and they want me to read them. And I say, I don't want to read them, but they want me to. And it explained the last really puzzle, is why she wrote so much. And so that evidence was critical. That was our most important witness, Dr. Braxton Bryant Wanamaker from South Carolina. And Alvin did such a good job. But 22 years later, we're doing another podcast, and the podcaster is speaking to one of our jurors who has now become a nurse in Alaska. And she said, I wish you would ask Mr. Poston something for me. And the guy says, sure, what is it? She says, I think Alvin may be autistic. Nobody was talking about autism in adults in 1998 and 1999. When I heard that she said that, I now knew in 2022, I now knew people, or 2021, I now knew people who had autism. And it instantly made all the sense in the world. But because the trial was over, I never thought much of it. Alvin, I did feel that I was helping him navigate the world still for like the last 15 years, taking him to lunch once a week. And, because he didn't know anybody else, really. He didn't frequent anybody else, save one barber in Tunnel Hill, a small town down the road. And otherwise, he would just go around restaurants and, flirt with ladies and, but he had a very childlike, he'd be excited and he'd say, I have a girlfriend now. And I said, what's her name? Well, I don't know yet. She was a server who was kind to him, but he was hopeful. So I said, Alvin, Kimberly Clark Barnes suspects that you may have a condition that could explain a lot. It could explain everything from childhood to people being mean to you and Alvin remembered bullying as if it was yesterday. And we're talking about childhood stuff that he just really, really still was something that he described. And so I took him to Atlanta and he gave me permission to talk about it. And talking about it immediately gained Alvin some fans in the community, because there was a part of the community that just thought, well, he just got away with it. And now they had an explanation for the death stare that he would give them and the fact that he wouldn't speak when spoken to, or sounded a little menacing when he did speak. And so it was quite a revelation. And the diagnosis that he was neurodivergent, but it also made me realize I can write this book now, because there is a call to action. There's 5 million neurodivergent, undiagnosed neurodivergent adults in this country, all of them ready to have the same type of misunderstanding and misjudgment with law enforcement, lawyers, and judges. Anybody in law knows of a judge that makes a lot of seat of the pants decisions about sentencing because the person won't look them in the eye. And a lot of decisions made at the last minute for that kind of thing. And a lot of autistic people are not comfortable looking you in the eye. It allowed me to communicate much more clearly with Alvin, for me to learn how to communicate with him. And it was a blessing to know that. And with Alvin's permission, I wrote the book. And it ended up being quite it was a story. And I hope I did it justice, but it was a hell of a story. I poured a lot more of my own personal life into it. Most folks liked some. There's always a critic somewhere, but I'm glad I did. It was kind of cathartic to write. And it's doing quite well. What's funny is what can move a book along. There is a new #1 Apple podcast, and it's called Noble, Noble. And it is the story of the tri-state crematory scandal in North Georgia in the early 2000s, where there were 339 bodies that were not cremated, and not the cremains not given back to families, and in their stead, cement dust and other things were given. And all these bodies were just stored and decomposing in this property. Well, that was my case too. And so when the podcasters came to me and said, hey, we would like for you to cooperate and participate in this case, I said, well, I'm kind of busy. I'm promoting this book. And he said, well, I'll mention your book. So the couple of weeks ago, episode 4 was about introduction into the case. And he mentions my book, and it went back up to #1 in its category. And it's, one of his, there are thousands of Amazon categories, so everybody can be #1 at some point. But I got to be it more than once. So I'm hoping that your fans will. I've got doing overkill in my Zoom room. I've got the poster back there, but it's the one with the kissing couple, and that's Alvin and Virginia in better days. Oh, there you go. It's blurring for some reason. I think you got your background blurred.
Yeah, I got my background blur, so you don't see the back.
Well, there you go. There you go. And I hope that your listeners will read it. I've been told by people who love someone who is neurodivergent. I've been told that first they say, I knew it from page 1. And I understand. I had to write it, though, from my position of ignorance at the time and my awe of what is going on with this guy, that he's so difficult. What is going on that he keeps looping? Looping is an actual term in autism. Looping back to the van, an obsession, an obsessive focus about the van. Now, Alvin's superpower was CRT picture tube TV repair. But what happened was there was a change in technology in the 80s to solid state circuitry. And even Alvin laments now that, people just throw their TVs away now when they break. And that's really what put him out of business. It wasn't the 3-week absence of the 1977 Chevy van that he chose to make it a permanent absence. And so I feel blessed to have been involved in a wonderful story. Alvin gave me a second act in life, and maybe a third now with this book. I'd love to write more, but I have to thank Alvin for that. Now, about 8 weeks ago, and Alvin was wonderful on the book circuit. The book launched at the Jimmy Carter Presidential Library in Atlanta. And I always took Alvin to the VA to see his doctor. And we had been monitoring some kidney function decline for several years. And that was one of the reasons we always wanted to get his labs and see how they were doing. But they seemed to be very slow in their decline. Well, until about 8 weeks ago, and they really just dropped precipitously to a GFR of 12, and that is a percentage of kidney function. So he went in the hospital, but when we were talking to the doctor that day, it almost brought tears to my eyes, because it almost brought tears to Alvin's eyes. He told the doctor, he said, we went to Jimmy Carter's place in Atlanta, and I spoke to 300,000 people. Well, the doctor looked at me and I said, take 3 zeros off the end of that, and you're a lot closer. And it was 200 and something people. Alvin passed away last month.
Oh.
And it was a very sad time for my secretary and I, because we
How old
kind of
was
took
he?
care of him. 82.
82. Well, at least he lived a full life.
And we miss him very much. I miss going to lunch with him twice a week, as I've done for several years.
Well, this is an amazing story. I have my copy of the book. I look forward to reading it, but really appreciate you telling this story. There's so many levels to this, and I think you laid out an important point that I don't think we think about nearly enough, and that is, understanding the client as much as understanding the case. This was a misdiagnosis of of what happened to the victim or his wife, and but they also misdiagnosed what was going on with him.
Well,
And
nobody was testing for autism back then.
well, and understandable, but the problem is that we think we know by people's demeanor what they're going to do. They call this demeanor evidence. And they read all sorts of stuff into it that they don't know because they don't know that diagnosis, and nobody was thinking about it back then.
Yeah. Well, thank you for having me. It's an important story. I hope I did it justice. I've been told I did it justice, but I'd let your viewers and listeners decide. And please review the book. That kicks Amazon into a new level of algorithm. No matter what your review is, it works some magic.
All right, we've been talking with McCracken Poston. The book is called Zenith Man. Sad to hear that Alvin passed away last month, but glad to hear that he died a free man and was able to get some understanding for why he was so eccentric. This has been Everyday Injustice. I'm your host, David Greenwald. Join us again next time for more tales from the injustice system.
Thank you to George Powell and Norman Mousequake Barrett for the use of our opening, Everyday Injustice. You can see more of George's music at www.justiceforgeorgepowell.com.